I had to put a whole front to get together. Yeah.
Okay, so did everybody see my email that I had messed up on the totals so that you guys did much better percentage-wise?
Yes.
Thank you. So I decided not to go back and make the multiple choice worth 3 points instead of 2.5 points, which is what it was supposed to be. So because that would have brought people's grades down. So I thought I would make everybody's day and bring them up rather than bring them down. Okay. Okay, so we talked about muscle physiology on Monday. So we talked about a sliding filament model and how at the microscopic level we have organelles inside of our muscle cells that have those myofilaments, the actin and the myosin, and that through the use of ATP they can bind and the myosin heads can ratchet and cause the sarcomeres to contract. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk more about muscle movement at the muscle level, at the organ level. And so when we talk about motor units, this is one motor neuron plus all the skeletal muscle fibers it innervates. Innervates. So remember that innervation just means that the neuron makes a connection. It synapses with the skeletal muscles and it releases acetylcholine into the synapse. This is just a squiggle. So it just releases acetylcholine into the synapse. So we can have small motor units. And what this means is that one motor unit or one motor neuron would only synapse with a few skeletal muscle fibers. So just one neuron, a few muscle fibers. And this is actually what allows you to do fine movement. So it allows for small and fine movements. So if you can imagine like in your face or in your hand where we're capable of really small, fine movements, then we would have more small motor units compared to say something like your trapezius muscle, which is right here. So if I tried to just move a little bit of that trapezius muscle, it's like the whole thing moves, right? So it's not capable of fine movement. And that's because some of our muscles only have large motor units. And so this is where you have one neuron and you have many fibers, which is another term for a skeletal muscle cell, right? And this allows for what we call gross movement or large movement. Okay. So the other interesting thing about the motor units is that the motor fibers that one neuron innervates are not just in one place of the muscle, but they can actually be distributed over the entire muscle. So if we look at a diagram that demonstrates this idea about motor units, this is from your book. And so notice that these motor neurons, their cell bodies are in the ventral horn of the spinal cord, and then they come out through the ventral root. And then notice how they go and they synapse. And in this particular instance, they're kind of distributed over the muscle fibers of one particular muscle fascicle. And so what this means is that if I just want to move my muscles a little bit, say if I just want to move my bicep a little bit and create a little bit of tension, then I'm only going to use a few motor units, but it's going to cause the whole muscle to contract. So my biceps is also not capable of fine movement. So if you try to like move like the outside of your biceps versus the inside, it's impossible to do, right? And that's because the motor neurons are extended over the entire muscle. And so when I just contract a few, it just lightly, just gently does the contraction. So it doesn't create much force, right? And so that's the principle behind the muscle movement, whether it could be fine or whether it's gross movement. Okay.
Is the red and blue, the motor units, does that signify like inhibitory and excitatory?
Not in this particular instance.
Okay.
So in this particular instance, it's just showing that the biceps muscle would have lots of motor neurons going to it, right? It's not just one neuron that innervates the biceps, but it's many neurons that innervate it. And so that's just showing the two different motor units. So that's why it's motor unit 1 and motor unit 2 in red and blue. That's a great question. And then we saw something like this when we were looking at in lab, when we were looking at those synaptic terminals of the motor neurons on the long skeletal muscle fibers. Oh, there's tissues there? That's good to know.
And hand sanitizer.
And hand sanitizer. Okay.
Very important, everybody.
So we're going to be talking about muscle contraction, and when we have one motor neuron causing one muscle contraction, that is what is called a muscle twitch.
Like when your eye twitches
Well, your muscles will twitch, but yes, your eyes do twitch sometimes involuntarily. So sometimes you get twitching in muscles involuntarily, but a muscle twitch is just used to describe what happens when you get one stimulus causing one muscle contraction, right? So one motor neuron causing one contraction in a fiber. And the muscle twitches have a characteristic graph. And so the first part of the muscle twitch is what is called the latent part. So the latent section is where there is a lag between the stimulus and the response. This is the latent period, the latent period and response. So the lag is just a little momentary pause between, and if you think about everything that has to happen, and the action potential has to get to the bottom of the neuron. It's got to excite and cause depolarization in the skeletal muscle. Calcium ions have to be released. They have to bind your troponin. Myosin has to bind, and the muscles slide. So that's all happening in that latent period. Okay, so that's the lag. And interestingly, we'll look at how some motor units have a longer latent period than others. And so some muscles are capable of fast movement, and some muscles are more slow and don't respond as quickly. Okay, and then we have the contraction period. So this is where the muscles shortens. And then we have relaxation. And the relaxation is where the muscle returns to its proper length. So the muscle shortening is where the sarcomeres shorten and they slide, but then they have to release. So remember, the myosin head has to release from the actin, and then the calcium ions have to be taken back up into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and everything has to come back to a period in which it would be able to be stimulated again. So this relaxation period, if it is long in some muscle fibers, then it is going to be harder for you to stimulate it again and get another response. And one of the interesting things about the heart muscle, which we're not going to talk about in detail, but the heart muscle has generally a longer relaxation period so that it cannot go into tetanus. So it's not going to be repeatedly stimulated and then contract forcefully and stay contracted like some of our muscles are capable of doing, some of our skeletal muscles. And so that relaxation period is important. So if we look at a twitch, it looks like this. Okay, so we're talking about milliseconds. So, you know, there's, it's relatively quick, right? But that, notice that period of time, the stimulus, right? The action potential, the neurotransmitters bind and cause that depolarization. And then the muscle contracts. And then notice how it's quite a bit longer for relaxation. So that period of relaxation, where everything goes back to where it can be stimulated again, can be long. And so if we look at the different twitch responses in different muscles, we see that there is a difference between fine motor muscles and gross motor muscles. So if you look at the muscles of the eye, so these would be the skeletal muscles that surround your eye, right? And allow you to move your eye up and down and back and forth, right? And we know that those are really fast, right? So they tend to be really fine movements. And so look at their twitch compared to the soleus and the gastrocnemius, which are calf muscles. So the calf muscles have a very different graph in terms of what their twitches look like, right? And so they tend to be, takes a longer for them to contract. They contract longer periods of time, and then relaxation takes longer. So that is what is called a twitch. Okay. So we can look at how the stimulus frequency changes the force of contraction. And so the stimulus frequency would be the number of stimuli in a given period of time. So if we have a high stimulus frequency, that means that there's lots of stimuli. So it might look like this, right? You have stimuli like this, right? So this is high versus low. Now, the thing about muscle contraction is that it differs from action potentials in that we have graded contractions. So it is not all or none. Sometimes the contraction can be really light and not create a lot of force. And then sometimes the contraction can be really strong. So this allows for graded contractions. Through what is called wave summation. Right? So graded means that the contractions are not all or none. Right? So you can have a weak versus a strong contraction. So what this means is that if we have a high stimulus frequency, we might stimulate the muscle fiber to contract again before it has completely relaxed. And so if we look at a diagram of what this looks like from your book, it looks something like this. So here would be one stimulus on right here, and you can see that there's one twitch. But if we take the stimulus and we stimulate it before it has completely relaxed, then you start to get waves that increase in tension. So this is increase in the strength of contraction. And so this means that the stimulus causes more contraction, more forceful contractions. If it occurs again before complete relaxation of the muscle. So that means that you're sending more action potentials out from the cerebral cortex, and it's leading to a more forceful contraction. So that would be like, you know, lifting up this versus trying to lift the table, right? I'm gonna maybe send more motor contract or more motor signals out here to increase the force at which my biceps are contracting. You'll note now, then you'll notice something really interesting. If the stimuli come too frequently, then you get what is called tetanus. And tetanus comes in unfused, where there's part relaxation. So this up here, this would actually be unfused tetanus because there's a little bit of relaxation. So we see that there is a period or periods of partial relaxation. And then we have fused tetanus, which is where there is sustained, complete contraction. And so that would create a lot of force over a given amount of time. So when you get like a muscle cramp, like you can sometimes feel this coming on if you have a cramp in your calf muscle, it starts to twitch, right? And then you can kind of sense the building of the tension and you're like, okay, relax, do something. Move your foot somehow, right? You're like, don't let it go into tetanus, right? And then when it's all cramped up, that would be fused tetanus. Okay? That could be due to imbalances in ions, but it can also be to the nervous system sending out action potential. Some people also think it has to do with dehydration, because if you're dehydrated, you're more likely to develop these. Now, this is really important to realize that this is not what you get shots for.
I was supposed to ask you, like,
Okay, yeah. No.
So is the unfused, is that the part where you can kind of feel like the cramp coming?
Yes, you can feel the tension building,
Okay.
but it doesn't completely relax, right? And then when it completely cramps, then you have that sustained tetanus. People think that, when people have these supernatural, actually not supernatural ability to like lift cars and stuff, they think that that is also just like you use all your muscles to lift. And it doesn't happen very often in regular day life that we get that sustained, complete, fused tetanus. It's not very common, right? So this tetanus is not from the tetanus shot. So the tetanus shot, it's for a bacteria. Right, so it's for a bacterial toxin. So if you get scratched in the eye by a branch, for example, or if you step on a rusty nail or get scratched by a rusty barbed wire, sometimes you can get tetanus. And that toxin can actually lead to muscles contracting and staying contract. So the jaw is known for one of those. So like if you get tetanus from a bacterial infection, your jaw will stay contract, and it's due to the neurotoxin. So it's due to that. And so that's why it's called tetanus, because of the effect that it has on muscles.
So when you see those bodybuilders and you see their calves, they have videos of time of their muscle just completely contracting to the point they have like the whole muscle sticks out on them. Is that fused, or would that still be the unfused state of a muscle? Because I mean, it just holds for like almost 2 minutes at a time, some of those videos.
That's a good question. I'm not sure. Yeah, it looks like they're,
Of how to pick.
but I think it would be painful for if it was to stay contracted. If it's not relaxing at all, I think that would be really painful. But I don't know, maybe they can train their bodies to do that.
No, it's a side effect.
Do they look like they're in pain? Is it painful?
Oh yeah, they're screaming.
Oh, they're screaming? Okay,
Oh,
well
yeah.
then that's probably they trained their body to do that fused tetanus if it's really painful for them to do it. So essentially causing a cramp in their muscle. Yeah.
Yeah, they overwork out and
Yeah.
then it just goes.
I know. One of the problems with muscle builders is sometimes they build so much muscle mass that it actually limits their movement. So they become muscle bound and they don't balance the muscle masses on either side. And so their muscles become so contracted that they actually can't, they're essentially kind of weak because they can't move their body right.
Okay, I have a question.
Yep.
Go back to the muscle twitch. I wanted to ask you that I thought I could let it go, but I can't let it go.
Okay.
So the muscle twitch, how does that work when you're sleeping? If your body, like, when you're drifting to sleep and your whole body jerks and you're kind of like, whoa. Not the where you're dreaming and you think that you're falling off a cliff, not like that, because I think that that's more of a dream thing. But when your body is relaxed and you're laying there, what causes your body?
Well, if you think about it, you have these electrical signals in your brain, specifically your cerebral cortex, all the time. And as you fall asleep, your muscles are relaxing, and then it could just be an impulse that gets transmitted to the muscles that causes them to. So generally, is right before when your muscles are relaxing, they start to twitch, and so I think it just might have to do with it, kind of an errant. We also have spinal reflexes that help to stabilize the joints, and so it could also be reflexive. So it could be the spinal cord causing a reflex. Yeah.
Do you think that initial, before you go to sleep, may cause the muscle to relax even more?
Yeah, if you think about it, when the muscles contract, that could actually lead to a relaxation if it's pulling on the tendons. Yeah. Okay, so that's one way to get a graded potential. The other way to get a graded potential is through stimulus intensity. And so this is where you increase the voltage, okay? So you increase the voltage of the stimulus. So this is where another thing where it's not all or none, right? So when we were thinking about action potentials, once you got past that threshold potential, right, of negative 55 millivolts, it only went up to positive 30. But in muscles, it's different. So if you get a really strong signal sent to the muscles, they'll actually depolarize more. And so that voltage causes an increase in the muscle contraction intensity. And this actually has to do with what is referred to as motor unit recruitment. So what this means is that as you increase the intensity of the stimulus, you increase the number of motor units involved. And this increases, I do not want to restart now. So this says involved. Okay. So this increases the force of contraction. So this is just another way to get a graded potential. Oh yeah, so a graded contraction. Which means that it's not all or none. We have weak contractions and we have strong contractions. So in your book, they have a really nice diagram of this that just kind of shows the cross-section of the muscle and the motor units that are involved. So we do have a threshold that has to be met before any motor units will be recruited. But as you increase the stimulus, more motor units are recruited. So if we look at this diagram, this is just showing a cross-section through the muscle. So what that's showing in dark red is how many motor units are being activated, how many motor units are contracting, how many skeletal muscle fibers are contracting. So you notice here that over time, you can build contractions so that you can have a weak contraction, a medium contraction, and then you do have maximal contractions. So that has to do with the number of muscle fibers you have, right? And we did talk a little bit about how when you weight lift, you create little tears in the muscle fibers, and that can actually increase the number of muscle fibers you have in your muscle. So that if I were to get bigger muscles, I should have the ability to create more tension and to lift heavier things, right? Because I have more motor units to recruit.
What happens to the muscle fibers
they shrink in size. And so I don't think that they go away. So I don't think that they don't get eaten up. But I think what happens is that the muscle fibers themselves decrease in diameter. And that's because if we don't need them, the proteins are just removed. And that can happen when you're starving yourself too. If you don't have any fat left to burn, then your body will actually start to burn protein and you'll start to lose muscle. And so when people are like, when they get cancer, sometimes the cancer cells are using so much of their energy that they'll actually start to lose drastic amounts of weight because they're just burning protein in order to keep up with their basic metabolic rate. So I think it has to do with not losing muscle, the number of muscle cells, but I think it has to do with losing the diameter. Okay. And that actually, the idea of that you could actually create more skeletal muscle fibers is relatively new. In the past, it was thought that you couldn't do that because muscle fibers were so specialized that they're not capable of reproducing themselves, right? So they can't undergo mitosis and produce more. But then there's now evidence that suggests those tearing actually is a way to produce more skeletal muscle cells. And so that's actually kind of a brand new, like within the last 10 years, this idea has come out, how to build muscle. Okay. So when we talk about muscle tone, this is where the muscles remain in a state of partial contraction. So your nervous system is kind of sending signals all the time out into your muscles. And this is very similar to the blood vessels. So the blood vessels are also under a little constant state of contraction, but that's smooth muscle. So this is really important because it keeps the muscles at the proper length, right? But it also helps to stabilize the joints. Right? So in people that have neuromuscular degenerative disorders like muscular dystrophy, where their muscles just start to atrophy, they get really floppy, right? And they're not able to move and their arms are kind of just floppy and they're more easily able to maybe dislocate their joints. And so one of the reasons why you want to have some muscle tone, so let's say you don't want big muscles, but you want to have some muscle tone in order to keep your joints stable. So in order to be able to use the full range of motion in your shoulder, you need to have some motor tone in your rotator cuff muscles. And the knee is a big one. So like if you damage your knee, say you hyperextend it, and then it gets wobbly, one way that physical therapists they do is they just give you light weights. And so you're not actually building muscle per se, but they make you do light exercises, maybe body weight exercises, where you build these tone in this muscle. So if these muscles are toned, then they're going to help to stabilize because they're connected to tendons that cross over the joints. And so muscle tone is very important for that reason, is that stabilization of the joints is a big deal. And so physical therapists work on creating muscle tone, not maybe building muscle mass, but just creating the tone in the muscle. So if you want a more toned body, that might be the reason why, right? Okay. Okay, isotonic contractions. So there's different types of muscle contractions and they're called isotonic and then also isometric. So we're gonna talk about isotonic first. So what does iso mean? Like when you talk about an isotonic solution, what is its ion concentration compared to another? Same, right? So this means same tension. Right? That's what that means in terms of the contraction. But what it means is that as the muscle tension develops, the muscle will contract. So this is the muscle contracts. in response to tension. Okay. So when I say the muscle contracts, this means that it shortens. Bless you.
And what is the tension?
The tension is the force exerted by the muscle fibers sliding together. So the tension is a force. So the force causes the muscles to contract. Okay. This is different than isometric. I'll put this because we're going to talk about isometric in a minute. But isometric means that the muscle does not contract. So the muscle stays the same length and tension increases. Okay, so isotonic contractions are what you're doing when you are in the gym weightlifting, when you're moving items, moving weights, or you're just moving, picking up things and moving them. Your muscles are contracting, right? And when we run, those are isotonic contractions because our muscles are contracting and they're shortening. So when we look at the isotonic contractions, there are two types. And this is where the tension, the first one is called concentric isotonic. And kind of means coming together. And so what this means is that when you bend your arm and you're lifting the weight, the tension is developing and the muscle is doing the work as it is contracting, right? So work is done while muscle is contracting. Or shortening, sorry, or shortening. In fact, let's put contracting out of there. So just shortening. Okay. So this is very different from eccentric contractions, where the muscle is actually doing the work while it is lengthening. And so bodybuilders oftentimes say that you have to pay as much attention to the concentric contraction as the eccentric contractions. So eccentric would be like if you're lifting a barbell and you bring it up like this, you also have to slowly release it down like this. So as I'm extending my arm down, I'm still doing work because I'm allowing it to extend down. This muscle, my biceps muscle, is still contracting, and my triceps muscle is contracting, but that would be eccentric contraction in the bicep. So I have a diagram that shows this. Okay. So the muscle lengthens while it's still under tension. So notice how when the barbell goes up, that would be concentric. When the barbell goes down, this bicep muscle, the tricep muscle is also working. The biceps muscle is still working because you're not just letting it go like this, right? So when you're like this, you want to be real nice and slow about it, right? Slow up and slow down. And so this is actually what generally makes people really sore. Eccentric contractions make you really sore, and also a lot of injuries can occur in the muscle and in the tendons when you're doing the eccentric part. So you have to be very careful when you're doing that part. Another good example, they mentioned a few of these, but another good example is like walking up a hill with your calf muscles. So as I step up the hill, I'm pushing off and my calf muscles are lengthened, right? And so I'm actually doing the work while my calf muscle is long, and that is going to make your calf muscles very sore. And the same thing kind of thing with your quads as you're coming down. Sometimes downhill running can cause muscle soreness in the quadriceps. Okay. So if we go back up to our diagram that shows this isotonic contraction, this would be where the muscle is able to overcome the load. So the weight here is not so great that when the muscle contracts, it can lift it. And so notice how the muscle shortens. And so that would be isotonic because the muscle is shortening. So if we compare this to the isometric contractions, which this is where the muscle cannot ever overcome the load. Okay. And muscles do not shorten. But tension develops. So actually isometric contractions are really important in kind of stabilizing the body. So if you think about stabilizing the spine, right? My muscles are not doing any work, right? But there is tension in the muscles next to my vertebrae column in order to keep myself upright. So these would be important in postural muscles. Holding a pose. So like if you go to yoga class or you go to Pilates class, they have you hold a pose. And that means that the muscle is not shortening anymore, right? But it is still contracting. And so that's going to build muscle strength. So you build the tension in the muscle, also creates muscle tone, right? So holding a pose in yoga, for example, or Pilates is an example of an isometric contraction. Okay. So in your book, they have a picture of this. And so this would be like if I wanted to push the wall, right? So if I put my hand against it and I'm pushing, my arm is not strong enough to push this wall, right? And so I'm just developing tension here, but nothing is happening. So my muscles are not shortening because I can't push it. And so I'm just developing tension in the muscles, right? So that would be isometric contraction. Also like lifting something, you can't lift, it's too heavy, your muscles aren't able to shorten and you develop tension. So the tension develops, but the muscle does not shorten. Okay, so this just shows muscle length does not, it stays the same, but we develop tension over time until the muscle relaxes. But there's no change in the muscle length. So hence isometric, same meter, same length.
But what is the kind of twitch that when, for example, you're working out or doing yoga and you're trying to hold that spot and you can feel your muscles shaking?
That is the muscle fatigue.
Okay.
So that's not really a twitch. It's more your muscles are starting to get tired and they're starting to kind of relax on their own. And other muscles are trying to, like, when that happens, your muscles are trying to partition the work, I think. And so some motor units are relaxing and some are contracting just to kind of hold that pose, right? Yeah, so there's some like plank can cause you to shake, boat can cause you to shake, right?
Is that good or is that?
It's a good thing, yeah, because, well, in yoga, the reason why we do that in yoga is hold a pose like that is that it teaches you to focus on your breath and release struggle. Yeah, but it's also building a muscle strength, yeah, and help build muscle tone and help to stabilize the joints and all that. Okay. So we're going to talk about muscle metabolism. So this is the chemical reactions that are used to create the energy that is going to allow our muscles to do work. Okay. So metabolism is just all the chemical reactions that are going to allow our muscles to do the work that they do. And so you'll remember that when we looked at the energy, And the reason why we have to have energy, right, the energy is in the form of ATP. And that's a kind of a common currency in the body. We can use sugars to produce ATP, we can use fats to produce ATP, and we can use proteins to produce ATP. So ATP can be converted into what is called ADP plus a phosphate group. So this is just where a chemical bond, a covalent bond, is broken between this molecule, and this releases energy. And in the case of muscle metabolism, remember that this energy is going to cause the myosin heads to become energized. Okay, so we have a chemical that does this conversion, and it's called myosin ATPase. So anytime you see an ACE at the end of that, that means that it is an enzyme. This is an enzyme that is attached to the myosin head, and it is what breaks down the ATP. Okay. Now, weirdly, there seems to be two different types of this chemical, depending upon what type of muscle fiber you're looking at. So sometimes they call muscle fibers slow twitch muscle fibers. Okay. Slow twitch muscle fibers are generally, they are slower because they have a different myosin ATPase, and so they do not contract as quickly, right? So don't contract as quickly. As quickly, okay? Fast twitch, on the other hand, right, these contract more quickly. And it's because there's two different forms of this. So when we look at slow twitch, when we talk about running, for example, this would be like the marathon runner. Okay. Fast twitch is like the sprinter. Now, there's some evidence that you are born with your particularly unique composition of fast versus slow twitch muscle fibers. However, there's also some evidence that you can, so it can be partially pre-genetically determined. So you have those marathon runners from Africa, you know, they might be predisposed to have more slow twitch muscle fibers. And when I did my 23andMe, that DNA thing, they actually said that I was more of a fast twitch muscle fiber person. So they thought that based upon my genes, I actually have more fast twitch muscle fibers than slow twitch. I don't know why, because I'm definitely not fast, right? But relative, right? So it can be genetically predetermined, but there is also some evidence that training might be able to switch the fibers from one form to another. So I guess if you were like young and you started running cross country, maybe you would develop more slow twitch muscle fibers than if you were running the 50-yard dash. Okay. So that just has to do with the type of ATPase, right? So that's the enzyme. So there's slightly different types of ATPase in the fast versus the slow twitch. Okay. So then we can talk about sources of ATP. So the first source of ATP is that some of our muscles, or most of our muscles, store a small amount of ATP. So this is number one. So that ATP actually is used up really quite quickly. Like within the first couple of seconds, you have used up all of your stored ATP, which means that you have to generate more. Okay? So the second thing that we use is we use a chemical called creatine phosphate. And creatine phosphate does this thing where it takes its phosphate and it adds it to ADP to produce more ATP. So creatine phosphate plus ADP, that's ADP, gives you ATP plus creatine. So what we call this transfer of one phosphate group to ADP, we call this direct phosphorylation. Okay. We don't have a lot of creatine phosphate stored, so this also is not for long-term energy. Not for long-term energy use. Okay. The second or the third source of energy is glycogen. And glycogen is a polysaccharide of glucose. And glycogen is stored in the liver, but it's also stored in the muscles. So I'll just put stored in liver and muscles. So glycogen can be broken down in a couple of ways. So it can be broken down in the presence of oxygen. So we have what is called aerobic respiration. So that means that this is using glucose and we're combining it with oxygen. And as a product, we're producing carbon dioxide and water and ATP. Oops, ATP. ATP. So this only occurs if we are breathing heavily enough to get enough oxygen to the mitochondria inside the muscle cells in order for them to use this type of metabolism. So this takes place in the mitochondria. Oops. Place. Okay. So that's the aerobic metabolism. And then I'm going to move to the next page here, which has the image on it. So in your book, they have the seconds approximately of energy. So what is that? 6 seconds ATP stored, 10 seconds of creatine phosphate, 30 to 40 seconds when we start to use glucose. And it can also be generated anaerobically. So anaerobic respiration is without oxygen. So think A, that A, they put an N in there just to make it so that wasn't two A's. So anaerobic means without oxygen. Okay. And this produces ATP, but not as much ATP. So it produces less ATP. Than aerobic, right? And one of the problems is that it also produces a waste product. So it produces lactic acid. Right, so if you're not breathing heavily enough, then you'll start to use anaerobic. So this would be like, for example, if you are weightlifting. So generally when you're lifting weights, your muscles are needing more energy than when you are, than you can actually breathe in, right? So anaerobic exercises are like weightlifting, which is one of the reasons why you can get sore when you're weightlifting, right? Aerobic would be like taking a walk, right? So you can breathe enough to get enough oxygen into your body so that you don't go into O2 loss, right? Depletion, and you can use that to produce energy. And this does not require mitochondria, so it does not occur in the mitochondria. Now at the final stage, so what number were we on? Is that 3, 4? This was 4. Let's see. We're using glucose though, right? Still. Oh, so this is still 3. Okay. So this would still be using glucose. So 4 would be that you use other organic molecules to produce ATP. So example of this would be triglycerides. This is the lipid that is stored as fat. So the thing about burning fat is you have to burn through all of your stored glucose before you actually start to burn fat, right? And so generally you have to get rid of all the glucose before your body will start to switch into fat burning mode, right? And then from there, if you burn all of your fat, which is a bad thing because we want some fat, right? You start to use proteins, like in the muscles, right? So your muscles will start to atrophy because you're using the proteins in them. And this is done by the liver. Okay, so these are used to produce ATP. Okay, but you have to have a healthy liver in order to utilize them, triglycerides and the protein. Okay. So this is a diagram. This is a really good diagram, that shows the direct phosphorylation versus the aerobic and anaerobic pathways. So lactic acid, this can actually be reconverted into pyruvic acid and then put back into producing ATP. But this is the aerobic pathway, which produces a lot more ATP per glucose molecules than the anaerobic pathway. Okay. So we can talk about, and this, I just was doing this in order of what's in your textbook. So next they jump to the force of contraction. So when we look at things that affect the force of contraction, we could talk about the diameter of the muscle fibers. So one would be the diameter of muscle fibers. Okay, so we increase the diameter. This increases the force. So this would be building muscle, hypertrophy. We can increase the number of fibers stimulated. And is this wave summation or recruitment? Recruitments. The third thing that's really important is the length of the muscle fiber. So that length of the muscle fiber actually means that there's an optimal where you have the most overlap. So the optimal length creates the most overlap. between the myosin and the actin. And so this is another reason why I think people that have big muscles and they're constantly contracted, right? Their muscles are contracted, is they don't have a lot of force with their muscles because their muscles are not at the proper length. So if we look at a diagram that shows this relationship, okay? So this shows the size, right, of the number of muscle fibers activated. This shows the differences in diameter. And then you can also talk about the frequency of stimulation. So that would be wave summation. And then the stretch of the muscle. So what I want to show you here is the muscle stretch. So this is actually, I think this is kind of a cool diagram because it shows the length of a sarcomere as opposed to the tension, the percent of tension that is produced. So notice that if your muscles are contracted already, then the sarcomere can't shorten, and so there's very little tension, right? And then if you're excessively stretched out, then there's very little overlap. So notice that there's only 1 or 2 myosin heads that are actually overlapping the actin. So when they contract, the force is very low. So it's like 50% at maximum, right? So you have an optimal length. So this is why, like, if you were going to, probably if you were going to do a sprinter, right? You wouldn't want to like stretch out really, 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 really excessively before you went and ran, right? Because you want your muscles at the proper length so that they can create the most force. Okay, so the last thing we're going to talk about are the different types of muscle fibers. So we talked about fast versus slow. We also need to talk about oxidative versus glycolytic. So oxidative means that it is using aerobic metabolism to produce ATP. Glycolytic means that it is using anaerobic, because glycolysis occurs outside of the mitochondria and it produces lactic acid, pyruvic acid that can be turned into lactic acid. So this is anaerobic metabolism.
Will you say that one more time, though?
Glycolysis is the first step of breaking down glucose, and it produces pyruvic acid, and then that gets turned into lactic acid. But that's outside of the mitochondria. It's in the cytoplasm of the cell, and it does not produce as much energy. So that would be without oxygen. Okay. So if we look at these oxidative muscle fibers, one of the interesting things about them is that they are dark in color. And it is because they have a pigment called myoglobin. So what does that word look like, myoglobin? What does it make you think of in terms of the blood? Hemoglobin, right? So myoglobin is like hemoglobin. It binds to and helps transport oxygen. So it transports oxygen, and it's called myo because it's in the muscle. So this transports oxygen.
But it's the same thing that hemoglobin.
In the muscle, yep. So this means that there's going to be more oxygen inside the oxidative muscle fibers than inside the glycolytic. And the significance of this is that this is like the dark colored skeletal muscle that you would eat, right? So this would be like, let's say, if you've ever eaten duck, wild duck, right? Dark meat. There's a little bit of dark meat, maybe in the legs of a chicken, but generally the duck has dark meat, right? And that is because these oxidative muscle fibers are fatigue resistant because they're using anaerobic respiration, which means they're not producing lactic acid. So ducks migrate, right? So their breast meat is dark, right? As compared to the lightness of a chicken. That only chickens are like sprinters, right? If they need to get away from a predator, they sprint up into a tree, right? Or they run away, but they don't run very far and they don't fly very far, right? Okay. So these are light in color. Right? They lack myoglobin. They have fewer mitochondria. And they fatigue easily. So let's combine the fast versus slow. So which one do you think would be slow? The oxidative or the glycolytic? No. Slow, think marathon runner. Which ones are marathon runners going to have more of? Oxidative, right? So these are slow twitch only. Okay. So there's no such thing as a fast oxidative fiber. Okay. However, when we look at the glycolytic, there is slow and fast. And there's some evidence that you, upon exercising, say you only had fast glycolytic fibers because when you exercised, you only did high intensity workouts, training intervals, right? And so then if you started to run miles, some of those fast could be converted to slow. So in some cases, in terms of exercise, these can be converted between each other. Can be converted from one form to another. So if you have fast and then you start to become a runner, some of those will turn into slow, a long distance runner. Okay. So if we look at a cross section through muscle tissue and it's showing the color of it, oops, I went the wrong way there. Okay. So notice that the slow oxidative is very dark. That is due to the myoglobin. And so that actually would have more protein than the white. This is fast glycolytic. Right? It's very light in color. Now fast oxidative, oh, I did that wrong, didn't I? Sorry. Screw that up. We'll just have to go back. I thought I had that figured out. I was like, oh, I got to study this before class. I thought I figured it out, but I didn't. I said it backwards. Okay, let's scratch this out. Sorry. This is fast only. Okay. This is slow or fast. Whoosh. Okay. So fast is going to be lighter in color. Sorry about that. So the slow is going to be the darkest in color. The fast is going to be a little bit lighter. It does have some myoglobin in it, but not as much. And then the glycolytic is fast only. So if you had lots of fast, you could switch those fast oxidative to slow oxidative and back and forth. So these can be converted.
So is the glycolytic still light in color also?
The glycolytic is always light in color.
Okay, and
But the oxidative tends to be dark in color, but I put that the fast oxidative is lighter in color than the slow oxidative. So let's look at that again. So if we look at my diagram again, yeah. So this is the fast oxidative. It doesn't have as much myoglobin as the slow oxidative. And then the fast glycolytic is the white. Okay. And so in your book, there is a table that shows the differences between those types of fibers, the fast versus the slow, and the oxidative versus the glycolytic. Okay, so I'm going to stop there for today, and then we're going to move on to the next chapter, which has to do with biomechanics and muscle movement. Yee-hoo-hoo. So remember that you do have a quiz on Monday over the muscle tissue.
So is that not gonna be over the